And so I remember getting on the plane and thinking, well, that's it. I can only look forward now. I can't even look back. It's over. I still remember kind of the yelling and screaming of our relatives at the airport.
My guest today is Izabella Tabarovsky. Izabella is the Senior Program Associate at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, an organization widely considered the home of America's leading experts on Russian studies. In addition to having written extensively about Russia and Ukraine, some of Izabella's many areas of expertise lie in subjects like the Holocaust, Soviet anti-Zionism, and its relationship to contemporary anti-Semitism. Izabella, thanks so much for joining Podcasting Against Anti-Semitism. How are you doing?
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Okay, so I think that, we were speaking a bit before we started recording, and much of what you write about is very timely, obviously because of the Russia and Ukraine situation, which we will get to. But first, I want to ask you, your work shows that much of the contemporary left-wing so-called anti-Zionism that we see today uncritically uses the language and imagery of anti-Semitic Soviet propaganda. And I'm wondering, can you explain the parallels as you see them between the different kinds of anti-Semitism in Russia over the years with contemporary left-wing anti-Semitism?
Sure. My gosh, where do I start? Really, everything that the left says today, everything that goes under the label of anti-Zionism is something that I used to hear. It's something that I grew up in the Soviet Union. It's something that I read about in Soviet propaganda materials, which I have been researching over the last several years. They make for a pretty depressing read because it's the same slogans and you also know where they borrow them. And they borrow them, essentially, it's a reprocessed anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. So you take, Zionism is racism. Zionists are fascists. Zionists act like Nazis. The whole idea that Zionism is the greatest evil on earth and always suspect, and Zionists are always up to no good. But it's a conspiracist aspect to it. But then there are also even more specific things, like when we hear that Zionism is not the same thing as anti-Semitism, or that Zionists always cry anti-Semitism whenever the state of Israel is criticized, or whenever they have any kind of problems or issues. All of these things, it's just a direct parallel. And it's truly incredible for me to be hearing it today in America and in the Western press. I thought that I had left all of it behind when I first came to America in 1990. And over the last few years, I've suddenly had to go back to that and review all of it in order to understand these parallels.
Right. And it's very interesting because one of our previous guests on the podcast, the actor Eddie Marsan, he commented that anti-Semitism, often on the left, is considered a trendy racism because it manages to masquerade as anti-capitalism, as anti-imperialism, which are issues close to the heart of socialists. And I'm wondering, how has the contemporary left managed to successfully appropriate these tropes in a way that doesn't raise red flags in the same way that contemporary far-right anti-Semitism does when parroting Nazi ideology?
Well, look, I've thought about it a lot. I mean, the Nazi ideology is completely discredited. We are taught in school throughout various levels of our education, in the Jewish community certainly, how horrible and dangerous Nazi ideology is. There is simply no room for it in polite society. But somehow we as a society have failed to integrate the lessons of the socialist experiment into our understanding of the world. I don't quite know why that is, but I can see, and I'm not part of the educational system, so I don't quite know exactly what it is that professors put into their curricula, but I can see it from the knowledge that's reflected to me in my interactions with young people or even people in their 30s, I can see that my experience as a Soviet Jew is not incorporated into their understanding. It's very abstract. They are somehow taken up by the ideas of socialism, communism, as if it's never happened before, as if we haven't lived through it. And I think that that's a big part of it. And it surprises me because there are probably hundreds of millions of us who lived in the under the communist rule, who are still around, who are still alive. And I don't see any of us ever really being invited to speak, to share our experience. So there is a lack of integration. I think it's a part of it.
Not only that, but there's this odd phenomenon where, the aspects, like you say, of socialism, of communism, of the tyranny that's involved, gets not only whitewashed but romanticized in a way as a form of equality, in a way that just does not fly with the far right, and I just cannot understand how the victims of the of communist rule just gets ignored in this way.
Well, neither do I. Look, one of the things that I study is the Stalin's repressions, and more broadly, it's not just Stalin, because a lot of times people will say, well, Stalin, we know Stalin is horrible. We're not talking about Stalin. But the Soviet political system, the repression of the Soviet political system really lasted from the very beginning to the very end, right? We don't have to only take it to the extreme when the state was murdering like 1,000 of its own people a day in like 1937, 1938. The repressions continued all the way until the end. And if you take the kind of the entirety of victims, people, not only those who were murdered, but those who lost their property, people who were, expelled, resettled, entire peoples were resettled, family members who lost their rights because their loved one was placed in the gulag, right? Really, truly ruined lives, ruined families. I mean, it's tens of millions. So I find it shocking that they don't count. I think that the victims of the Soviet regime are really the most forgotten victims in the kind of Western history, or the history of the West of the 20th century. And yeah, it's shocking and devastating, because in my own family, and I'm no exception, pretty much every Soviet family has someone who was repressed in Soviet times. I have a great grandfather who was, grabbed for nothing, for some 4 phrases that he said over a period of months, and that's it, and disappeared, and the family never saw him again.
Right. So when you're watching this as the descendant of a victim of this regime, what are you thinking? What are you feeling when you're seeing these chants, when you're seeing these slogans out there?
Well, I feel, look, I want to try and zero in on the feeling here. I think that there is a sense of frustration, because how is it that, why do we have to go through this again, right? Why do we have to go through this romanticization of a system that already we have a 70-year-long experiment? Why don't we study it? So I'm perplexed and I'm shocked, and I'm worried, because it's not because I think that America will become the Soviet Union, or that it will especially become Stalin's Soviet Union, that there will be gulags in America. But there are certain aspects of the woke, for lack of a better term, right? But certain parts of the left, the far left, that do remind me of something that we have seen under a socialist system, a propensity to regulate thought, a propensity to regulate what can be said or can't be said, and the whole phenomenon about firing people on the basis of some wrong speech or wrong thing. I mean, entire careers being ruined. I find it shocking, again, because we have lived through something like that. So how did it come to America?
Right, right, and not only that, but it's interesting that a lot of the language and imagery appears to uh, claim that they benefit the working class, and yet a lot of this has been appropriated by the middle classes and by the middle class intellectuals and the universities. And again, how has it gone to this sort of movement? In a way that isn't for them, supposedly, it's meant to be for the working classes, and B, in a way that the far right hasn't managed to do.
Well, again, the far right, I think, is really excluded from kind of the legitimate public discourse, and so and has been. I really think that since World War II, I mean, World War II and the Holocaust have completely discredited the far right. So it hasn't been able to establish a foothold. And I'm talking about the neo-Nazi far right, because in the United States these days they would call, what I would call the right, they call the far right. So, but when I say the far right, I really mean like neo-Nazi, white supremacist far right. I mean that has never that since the war that has never really been able to reestablish its positions. But again, with the left, we never incorporated the lessons, and I think that these things are they're always or often led by intellectuals. I think that in the Russian Revolution, certainly the intellectuals played a critical role. Certainly Lenin was an intellectual, Marx was an intellectual. A lot of the intellectuals play an important role in kind of creating, establishing ideas, putting them into practice, disseminating them. And and so in that sense, it doesn't surprise me. Uh, but I do find it interesting that, I mean, we are not the Soviet Union. In America, everybody essentially still has a voice. And so it is obvious that the working class, the oppressed, I mean, I think that a lot of the identitarian left today speaks not so much about the working class as about ethnic minorities and racial minorities. And so they speak on their behalf. But a lot of these minorities, they don't necessarily reflect back the agreement with the new theories that we have. And so they're voting differently from the way that the intellectuals expect. So we'll see how that plays out in November. But I think we could see that already in the 2020 election. And I'm speaking about the US because that's the experience I have. So we'll see. We'll see if the people on whose behalf the intellectuals are speaking, if they will in fact follow them, or if they will decide that they have different interests.
Right, right. And you mentioned there that, the modern day romanticization of communism appears to benefit the minorities now. It's moved on to ethnic minorities and oppressed groups. However, I can't help but notice this often does not include Jewish people. And in fact, it often shoves them aside under the guise of anti-Zionism. Now, why do you think that is?
Why that is? That's the question.
That is the question.
Well, that is the big question that I think bigger people than me have not been able to answer. Why that is? I mean, look, we can get into all kinds of ideas. I would probably say that it's quite, as someone who is accustomed to looking to the past for answers to questions of the present. I think that it's that the left is just following in the footsteps that were laid for it by previous generations, and we saw how the previous generations, the research shows how the previous generations of the Western left took on the ideas that the Soviet Union was putting out pushing out to the global left regarding Jews and Zionists and Zionism and Israel. There was a massive campaign from 1967 all the way until the end of the Soviet Union, where Israel was demonized and Zionism was demonized. And it's interesting because, in a way, today's left is making the same distinction as the Soviets did. The Soviets essentially distinguished between Jews and Zionists. So they claim that they're not anti-Semitic, they're just anti-Zionist, which I think would sound a little bit familiar to a lot of us today.
Yeah.
And I struggled to understand it for a long time. And for a long time, I thought that they're just lying. And I think that at the time in the 60s, 70s, 80s, people in the West thought, well, the Soviets are just lying. But I eventually understood that what I think they meant. And I think what they meant is, well, they're for socialist internationalism. And so that means that so Jews who are for socialist internationalism are okay. And Jews who support the Soviet Union are fine. But they are against nationalism, they're against capitalism, they're against religion. So Jews who are nationalists are out, so it's okay to demonize them. So that's Zionists, right? Who are nationalist Jews? They're Zionists, so it's okay. We can demonize them. Jews who are capitalists, foreign Jews, we can demonize them. Jews who are religious Jews, we can demonize them too, because we're in general against religion. So they had these big categories that they demonized, and within those categories, they demonized specific Jews. But of course, once you start demonizing one category of Jews, let alone like two or three categories of Jews, you end up, it's such a massive dog whistle to every anti-Semite under the planet that they all come and join your ranks, and you are anti-Semitic, fundamentally anti-Semitic. And I think that one of the really key lessons that I think, if there's anything that I want people to remember from this podcast, it's this, that the lesson of Soviet Jewry teaches us that anti-Zionist rhetoric creates anti-Semitic outcomes for Jews, because what we lived under was anti-Zionist rhetoric and demonization of Israel, not directly demonization of Jews on the part of the state, demonization of Israel and Zionists. And this always leads to anti-Semitic outcomes. And it's important because today a lot of Jews kind of don't really understand why they should worry about left-wing anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. They think it's a lighter version of anti-Semitism, but it isn't.
Yeah. And, it really strikes me, as you say, even back then, this is like 100 years ago now, they were saying, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist, and well, these types of Jews are okay and these types aren't. And we do see that today, especially on our university campuses. We see that, yes, these Jews, we're the anti-Zionist Jews, and therefore they're sort of the accepted ones in a lot of cases. And it's shocking. And this isn't really something that I think the general public knows about. I think the general public thinks anti-Semitism equals Nazis. A lot of the time, if they don't know any Jews, a lot of people might think that. So what do you think can be done to inform the general public about the origins of some of the tropes that we see on the far left?
To be honest with you, I think we need to start with ourselves. I think a lot of us in the Jewish community as a whole, don't understand this. I think we need to start incorporating the teaching of that history into our curricula. And I think for Jews to start with, for the Jewish communities, it will be a really natural thing to be teaching. I actually find it shocking. I think I've overused the word shocking today, but I do find it shocking that that at least American Jews don't teach it, but frankly, British Jews as well, because both American and British Jewish communities played such a huge role in the movement for Soviet Jewry, massive role for at least a generation. So it's a story. It's an empowering story. It's a story that has heroes. It's a story it's an aspirational story. So I think we need to start teaching it to ourselves and talking about how back then, not that long ago, in the 70s and 80s, I know it may seem like truly ancient times for the younger listeners, but it's not that long ago, 40 years ago. That's okay, not that long ago. Jews actually understood that anti-Zionist rhetoric that was coming out of the Soviet Union was anti-Semitic. So I think we need to start learning ourselves, incorporate it into Jewish school curricula, right? Invite people. I mean, we have the tradition of inviting Holocaust survivors to speak on Yom HaShoah, right? On Holocaust Remembrance Day. Well, establish a day, or simply just in general, invite people who survived the Soviet Union, right? And talk to them. And I think a lot of times, American Jews certainly feel like, well, Soviet Jews are too right-wing for us. Okay, that can be the case, but not always. I mean, and maybe we need to kind of set aside the politics and just ask them about their experience as Jews under a communist system. And for the broader public, again, same. It's education. I mean, it would be amazing to incorporate the teaching of that into high school curricula and university curricula. But to be realistic, I don't know how soon that can happen. But I think invite speakers, talk to people. Also create videos, explanatory videos. There are some very effective ways that different organizations create, just like short 3-5 minute videos with one speaker, explain it idea by idea so that it can be spread on social media, non-political, just purely explanatory, because people are missing the very basic facts.
Yeah. Okay. You know what? In this we're going to make the video right now. We're going to take it from the podcast, and please, can you explain to the listeners? And I am going to bring it back to the far right briefly, only because I think to so many people, well, as we've said, I think to so many people, far left anti-Semitism is such it just doesn't compute that they need a frame of reference. So to bring it back to the far right, Jews were persecuted during the Holocaust, broadly on the lines of racial purity. Okay, what does that look like in the Soviet Union? Why were Jews being persecuted then? What was the main reason? What was the main propaganda saying then?
Right. So there was kind of everyday anti-Semitism, but then there was also state-sponsored anti-Semitism. And so when the state talks all the time about how horrible and dangerous Zionists are, and how they are essentially traitors to the motherland, and the state arrests Jews that it considers to be Zionist and puts them in the Gulag or puts them on secret trials, every Jew becomes suspicious, falls under suspicion. And so what you have in the 1970s as this campaign goes on, also in the Soviet Union, because it was connected to the immigration, to the demand to immigrate, because Jews are realizing increasingly that they can't live in the Soviet Union anymore, that there is no future for their children. The anti-Semitism is too high, and they can't be Jewish. And so there is a movement for immigration. And so that gives the state an excuse to say, well, these are traitors. They're traitors to the motherland. And so you have that kind of classic view of Jews as the fifth column. Now, the state essentially says that Zionists are the fifth column. But this is where, there is truly no separating line. Everybody else begins to understand that it's really, they're talking about Jews. Because if you are, let's say you are, this was especially like one of the areas that it affected was television and radio. They really didn't want Jews in these prominent places where they could be broadcasting to the public because they didn't trust them. And so if you're a manager of some local television station and you're hearing that Zionists are dangerous and you shouldn't be hiring any Zionists, you don't know who Zionists are. But you look around and you see 3 Jews in your organization. Well, you're going to take them off air just in case, just so that they get off your back. And this is what starts happening, is that just to protect their backs, people start to exclude Jews. And it's happening in America already, actually. Like in the publishing industry, there was an article, an extraordinary article, that said that publishers often will not take on a book by a Jew who is known to be pro-Israel or Zionist, or a book that is taking a pro-Israel position. And it's like, it's not an announced boycott, it's a silent boycott. And I'm trying to remember, the article was in Washington Examiner. And nobody knows about it, but it happens. And it's like people do it not because somebody's going to punish them, but because it's like the air, there's the atmosphere like that. And so that's the danger.
Right, right. And you can sort of see how these small things creep up on you. It's not, Monday, everything's fine, Tuesday, everything's different. It's step by step by step. And I want to ask, what do you think is the most insidious example of Soviet anti-Semitism that is still popular today?
So I think that demonization of Israel is really the most insidious thing. When I look, I'm speaking to you now from Israel. And when I'm outside Israel, I see the lies that are being propagated about Israel because I'm educated about it. But when I'm inside Israel, it's especially shocking to see. It's just the lie is so clear and the lie is so big and it feels so evil, right? The kind of the size, the scale of that lie, and the persistence of that lie. I think it's extraordinarily dangerous because, again, from there, people believe it. They assume the worst of Israel. And from there, it spreads just like the Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda spread onto all Jews that were under Soviet command. Um, in the same way, demonization of this Jewish state ultimately permits and facilitates the demonization of Jews as a whole.
Right. Right. Now, as mentioned earlier, we touched upon Russia and Ukraine, and I want to go back to that. Now, 2 years ago, you wrote a piece which argued that Russian President Vladimir Putin's propaganda campaign turns Jews into props. And now, with Lavrov's comments a few weeks ago about Hitler's supposedly Jewish origins, let alone Putin's denazification rhetoric in connection with the invasion of Ukraine, it's very clear that Russian anti-Semitism has now had a light shone on it in a way that it hasn't in recent times. And in fact, one of our previous guests, John Benjamin, a senior diplomat who's currently the British ambassador to Mexico, noted that Lavrov's remark wouldn't have been a careless mistake, and that such a seasoned diplomat like Lavrov would have known what he was saying. Do you find that Putin's and Lavrov's comments echo the anti-Semitism of their Soviet predecessors, or that of their Tsarist forebearers? Or are we seeing yet another new form of Russian anti-Semitism?
Look, I think that on the one hand, when I saw those comments from Lavrov, those comments, and then also something else that happened that actually a lot of people that didn't get as much spotlight, because there was then a statement that the Russian Foreign Ministry put out to sort of corroborate Lavrov's statement. So when I saw that, on the one hand, again, it was as if I'm reading some old memos, old Soviet propaganda, or rather as if they're acting on these old Soviet propaganda memos. But there's also something new. I mean, with anti-Semitism, we know that it adjusts itself to the current conditions, right? And so something new comes, a new angle is applied to old anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and rhetoric. And so what was so extraordinary to me about what Lavrov said, and especially the follow-on statement, talked about, so Lavrov said the Jews are the worst anti-Semites. And so then when he got attacked for it, the foreign ministry put out a statement saying, well, but yes, of course, Jews collaborated, for example, with the Nazis. There were Jews who betrayed their people. So Jews who were part of the Judenrats. I mean, can you imagine the Russians coming out and talking about the Judenrats and the Jews who were in the Judenrats? It's like, where do you come off, talking about that? But this Soviet propaganda books did that. They just, back then they did it slightly differently with a different purpose. Now they do it in order to besmirch Zelensky and in order to prove themselves, in order to prove that Zelensky is a traitor to his own people and that a Jew can be a traitor to his own people. So it's old patterns with a new twist. And I think what's unchanged to my mind is that, look, Russia knows really, really well. Look, we have to remember that Lavrov has been in the foreign ministry for decades. The foreign ministry was critical in Soviet times to propagating the anti-Zionist conspiracy theories. Putin is, of course, a former KGB. They came out of this school. So I don't know if it's an instinct or if it's intentional, but they know really, really well how to manipulate the Jewish topic, the Jewish question, right? And they know the power of that manipulation. They know that it can unify their supporters, right? Hatred against Jews can really unify people across the spectrum, as we know. And today, there are people on the left and on the right who are taking a pro-Russian position, right, and an anti-Ukrainian position. And so I think when I ask myself, why did these remarks come out now? I think it's because, yes, they need to continue discrediting Zelensky, but who are they speaking to? I think that they're speaking to the Western left and Western right. So in Soviet times, the Soviet Union mostly spoke to the left. It addressed itself to the left and also to the developing countries. Today, they're speaking to both ends of the spectrum. And it's these dog whistles are very powerful in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it feels, and this may be a naive position, and if it is, I hope that you tell me, but it feels that the rhetoric and the propaganda that's coming out now isn't necessarily as effective as it was during the Soviet Union due to social media, whatever, but it feels like the world isn't buying it in the same way. Is that something you find or not really?
Well, it depends on who you ask. I think that, again, there are certain segments that do support them. It's not as effective because the situation is somewhat different. As you say, the world is much more transparent. So people see what they look at the destruction that Russia is um, uh, creating in Ukraine. And so, whatever, it's almost like it doesn't matter what they say. What matters is what's happening, right? They're destroying entire cities. I mean, it looks like, war crimes have been committed. Uh, Whatever it is that Ukraine may have done to displease Putin, none of it deserved, right, to this kind of level of destruction. So I think that in this case, that's partly why the world doesn't believe them. But I am pretty sure that if they continue with specifically the demonization rhetoric about Jews, and they're also now starting to kind of um, take revenge on Israel for taking Ukraine's side, right? I mean, the other day, uh, the Russian anti-aircraft batteries. I think I'm probably mangling the military terms, but they shot at Israeli planes over Syria, which they had never done before. And also at the beginning of the conflict, suddenly the foreign ministry issued this little tweet where it said, we want to remind Israel that we don't recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. So they are manipulating all of these things with regards to Israel as well. So I think that part, if it continues and if it gathers speed, if they continue seeing that Israel is not doing what they want them to be doing, I think that will be very dangerous.
Now, not only has propaganda changed over time, but so has the means of distribution. For example, in the early 1900s, an anti Semitic cartoon may have taken a few days to reach even a few hundred people. And now, thanks to social media, it has the potential to be seen by millions almost instantly. What role is social media playing in the spread of anti Semitism? And how does it compare to the propaganda from 100 or so years ago?
Well, I mean, look, I think that your question really contains the answer. I think this speed and the distribution. I mean, that's something that wasn't there even in. I mean, forget 100 years ago, even in the 70s and 80s. I think, to be honest with you, I think that the Soviets tried to approximate the reach of social media because they had a massive propaganda apparatus in their hands, massive, right? Huge, in a monopoly on all of the media in the entire massive Soviet Union. And also very, very close relationships, bureaus in like 100 countries around the world, uh, not necessarily control, but very much close to control over lots of kind of publications in the developing world and financing of left-wing publications. So they could, in a way, replicate the effect of social media. They could publish the same article in numerous publications so that the effect would be like across the entire country. But it certainly does not compare, of course, to social media. And I think that the speed of distribution is what's so dangerous because today incitement toward anti-Semitic violence, uh, let's say here in Israel, can arrive from Qatar or from Iran, and you will never know, right? Only like special services who monitor this can see if there is coordinated action or something like that. If you are just a consumer participant in this whole system, you don't see it, but you get the message. And I think that the potential for incitement for violence is truly, truly it's huge and it's dangerous.
Do you do you notice a difference in the content, in the style of the propaganda itself from 100 or so years ago?
Well, I mean, if we're talking 100 years ago, this is before the state of Israel is even formed. So I think that that's at that point. Um, at that point, there is still a debate about the kind of the Zionist concept hasn't yet proven itself. And so it's still one of the ideologies that's hanging around Europe, and nobody really knows, or among Jews also, nobody knows. It's an unproven ideology, right? It becomes radically different after the state is established, and it's obvious that it's a state that benefits the Jewish people in many, many ways, and the establishment of the state does, and it becomes part of the Jewish identity. So in that sense, I think that what we're hearing today, the whole argument about how the state of Israel doesn't have a right to exist, how we need to, if you take the new resolution that Rashid Tlaib has proposed, how essentially that we questioning the very partition of Palestine, right? Questioning the UN's decision. It's like people, I think Barry Weiss is the one who wrote in her book that it's like trying to, it's like it's the babies are already born. What are you going to do? It's an immoral, framework. And so in that sense, I think it's especially, the rhetoric today is especially sort of there's a particular dark shade to it. It's like, I mean, there are millions of people living in Israel. What are you going to do with it? Why are you discussing the right of this country to exist or already exists? So that, to me, if we compare it to 100 years ago, I think that's really kind of superficially one of the main differences.
Right, right. Now, coming to you for a second, your writing has sometimes referenced your life in the Soviet Union and the anti-Semitism that you faced there, and now you've moved to the States. Please, can you tell our listeners about your life in the Soviet Union and the circumstances under which you left?
Sure. So I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and uh, sort of came of age during Perestroika, which was actually a really exciting time to be coming of age in, because it was a transition from kind of a real sense of stagnation to something really exciting, to a sense of change. And I know that for a lot of people, this change was really threatening. But I think if you were young, if you were a teenager then, you felt like, wow, suddenly something new is happening, right? Suddenly there was music that could express who you were, that wasn't just imposed on you from above. Suddenly there were books that were published that hadn't been published before, specifically about, I'm thinking specifically about the books about Stalin's repressions that had been kind of pushed and, censored. And so there was sort of this sense of, wow, this cathartic feeling of suddenly knowing the truth and learning the truth, and suddenly processing what did it mean to have been born in this country and lived in this country, and the fact that, this regime, government after government, lied to you and you never knew the truth. So many discoveries. And it was a time when suddenly the West also came in the sense that, look, the media had always blocked everything from the West, information from the West. And we all longed for it in a way that, when something is prohibited, you really want to know. And the Western world really just seemed like something colorful and something unknown and something different. And so foreigners would come and they would bring mixed tapes of Western music, or they would come and they would wear jeans and people would try to buy jeans off of them, and like suddenly it's like it can seem so materialistic, but to me, it's like it was an expression of something different. It's like it represented distant lands that you never thought that you would ever see. So there was that aspect of it. And I think I grew up always knowing that we would want to leave, because of our Jewish side of the family, which we never really knew what it meant. I never knew what it meant. For Soviet Jews, it really, your your Jewishness was really an expression. Well, it was a lot of times you learned about your Jewishness through the teasing by children in the streets, and they would. I mean, none of us were religious. None of us knew what it really meant to be Jewish, but they would look at us. It was the classic thing of, Jewish nose. So you get teased and you get discriminated against. I had a hard time getting into the college that I wanted to get into because I was Jewish. That was those very years, the 80s that I was talking about, when the anti-Semitism was really on the rise. And when the doors opened, we left. Again, I always knew that we would leave. And I remember getting on that plane. It was very hard to it was permitted, but it was very hard to do. And you still left as a traitor of the people. And you still left with this knowledge that the state postulated that you will never be able to go back again. And so I remember getting on the plane and thinking, well, that's it. I can only look forward now. I can't even look back. It's over. I still remember kind of the yelling and screaming of our relatives at the airport. But yeah, you just look ahead and you leave. It's different now, since when you know that you can go back, it's different. When you are told that you can't go back, it's a very different feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. Now that you're sort of settled in a different country, and you have been for a while, in hindsight, do you ever, how do you look back on it now in contrast to where you're living now, both in general terms, but also in regard to anti-Semitism?
What's interesting is that when I first came to America, I think because of that experience of going through that, the process of getting permissions to emigrate, and then this thinking that you can never go back again, I came to the US and I essentially very quickly, I mean, I felt it was a very difficult time, but I realized that what I need to do is just to leave it all behind. And I wanted to learn as much as I could about America and how it works and what that's all about. And my whole Soviet Jewish identity, I think I never sought to cultivate it, to be honest with you. I think I just left it all behind for years and even decades, I would say. And it's only in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, as I saw this resurgence of this weird anti-Semitism, that suddenly I was like, why do I feel like I'm back in the USSR? Why are people saying things that I used to hear back in the Soviet Union? So it really, it's like woke me up. And then I had to, as I started researching it, I also had to delve back into what it meant to be a Jew in the Soviet Union and learned more about other people's experiences. And I think today that experience, actually, our collective experience as Soviet Jews, is something that it contains lessons that I think, I've said it before already, but I do think I want to repeat it. I really think that we need to incorporate it as a Jewish community as a whole in the West. We need to, or as a Jewish community on the whole, we need to incorporate that experience into our collective Jewish experience, because there are lessons in it. For example, I think what I find is that a lot of ex-Soviet Jews and even their children who were already born, let's say, in the United States, or who were very young when they came to the United States, they tend to be much more, it's much easier for them to see through this leftist, left-wing anti-Semitic propaganda, anti-Zionist propaganda. They see right through it. They have no doubts about maybe it's correct, maybe it's justified. No, they know what it means. They know that anti-Zionism, as it expresses itself under these terms, always leads to anti-Semitic outcomes. So they don't sit and think, well, is it anti-Zionism? Is it anti-Semitism? Which anti-Semitism is better or worse, right-wing, left-wing? They don't think about it because they get it. It's in their family's experience. And they tend to be stronger Zionists and a stronger pro-Israel force. And so I think that, first of all, we need to harness that force, but we also, I think, need to understand what is it in their experience that allows them to remain kind of to live in that conviction. I think it's something, and I know organizations that are led by former Soviet Jews who are bringing up a new generation of Zionists, young Jews who they want to grow up as Zionists and pro-Israel. I think that we need for that to become a broader phenomenon.
Now, for those looking to help in the fight against anti-Semitism, where would you recommend that they start?
Well, I think it depends on who they are, where they are, how old they are. I really think that there isn't a single answer. I think that everybody needs to find a way that speaks to them. I think this fight is big. I think that anti-Semitism is going to affect all of us. It is affecting all of us, and I think that each of us needs to find a way in which we are most effective. So for me, I found that kind of the right place for me to be is to be presenting this information to people. For somebody else, it may be something else. If you're a student, you may join the New Zionist Congress or students supporting Israel on campus, right? These are organizations that do that on campuses. If you are older, join I don't know, join a local organization, but just do something. Find an organization, just do something.
Right. Now, as we wrap up the podcast, Izabella, tell the listeners, what are you working on? What have you got coming up? And where can people find you?
Well, people can find me on Twitter at Iza Tabaro. What am I working on? As always, I have several plans in the works. I have an academic paper in the works where I want to. I think what we need to understand about anti-Zionism is that it is as much a conspiracy theory as any other conspiracy theory. So, in that sense, the left always likes to point to the right and say, well, the right is propagating conspiracy theories. But in this case, certainly, parts of the left, are very much under the influence of a conspiracy theory. So I'm working on a paper that kind of illustrates that, and hopefully other things. So look up for me. I typically publish in Tablet, but there may be other Jewish media. So yeah, but look for me on Twitter.
All right, check it out. And Izabella, thank you so much for joining Podcast Against Anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much for having me.